Hey guys, welcome to That Florida Feeling. How are you guys doing? I know that we are expecting more cold weather. I'm over it, but I guess we have to have winter every now and then and participate. Hopefully, this is the last. Hope everybody's doing good though. January feels like it's been 5 years at this point, but it's almost over. If you're doing dry January, congrats. I applaud you. I think it's a great thing if you do that. Just want to give a shout out to all the other podcasts on Unfiltered Studios. Definitely check them out. Hypno Wellness, Talking Codswallop, Sleepy G, KJ and A. All great podcasts, all different topics. Definitely going to have something you're going to like if you're looking for a new podcast or just want to expand your library. As always, thank you for listening to me at That Florida Feeling. I appreciate it. I've gotten some good reviews on Google and Spotify lately. Thank you so much. If you haven't done that, I would appreciate it. That is the easiest, best way to support a podcast, other than sharing my post on social media, which you can find me on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have an idea for That Florida Feeling, feel free to send me a message on any of those or email me at thatfloridafeel@gmail.com. I absolutely love hearing from you guys, even if you just want to say hey. I am here to just say hi. So today we're going to talk about a darker part of Florida's history. And it's not just Florida that dealt with this. This is pretty much the entire United States during this time. And that is, we're going to talk about what used to be known as the Chattahoochee Asylum, today known as Florida State Hospital. Florida State Hospital is a hospital and a psychiatric hospital in Chattahoochee, Florida. Which, if you're not familiar with Chattahoochee, Florida, it is basically at the border of Florida and Georgia. And I mean, like, sits directly on the line kind of thing. And so we're going to talk about it. It was established in 1876, so it's very old. It was Florida's only mental state institution for mental health, or whatever people classified as mental health, until 1947. It is still open today. It currently has about 1,050 patients. It is actually classified as the National Register of Historic Places for its administration building. So it is very old. It has served other purposes, though. Originally, it served as a military arsenal during the Seminole Wars, as well as the American Civil War. It was also the site of Florida's first prison before becoming a mental hospital. Originally known as Florida State Hospital for the Insane, people came to know it as the Chattahoochee Asylum, or just calling it the Hill. It did open in 1876, and it gained notoriety over the course of its very long history. Not good, more like infamy. It's actually had a court case against it. It was sued in O'Connor v. Donaldson, and a case that would end up in the Supreme Court that I'll talk about in a little bit. But let's talk about what caused it to go from an arsenal to what it is today. The hospital campus was originally the Apalachicola Arsenal. It was built in the 1830s, and it was named after the nearby Apalachicola River. The hospital's current administration building was adapted from the original office quarters of the Arsenal. Again, like I said, it is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was built in the 1830s. The Arsenal facility served as a supply depot during the Seminole War, and the first engagement of the American Civil War that took place in Florida actually happened on January 6th, 1861, when Confederate militia unit from Quincy overtook the Union soldiers at the Arsenal. So it's had a very long, interesting history so far. In 1868, Florida Governor Harrison Reed converted the Arsenal property at Chattahoochee into Florida's first penitentiary. And Florida's first recorded inmate was Calvin Williams, who was incarcerated in Chattahoochee in November of 1868 for the crime of larceny. Basically, larceny is unlawful taking or theft of personal property. So basically theft. And he was sentenced to 1 year. About a year later, there was 42 inmates and 14 guards. I feel that's a very interesting amount of guards to inmates, I'm just saying. In 1871, the prison was put under civilian jurisdiction. Malachi Martin was appointed as the warden, and he gained a reputation for being cruel and corrupt. He used prison labor for his own personal benefit to build houses and tend to his personal vineyards, which created him a huge fortune. Um, the book American Siberia, which was written in 1891, actually talks about the Chattahoochee prison, and it is a place of relentless barbarity. Direct quote. After the prisoners were relocated in 1876 to Rayford, which is still Florida State Prison today, I did an episode on it. The facility was quickly converted into a state hospital. So this has not been a very loving, great place so far. By 1876, the prison was refurbished and established during the Reconstruction era. Legislature deemed it as the Florida State Hospital for the Insane, and became the state's first mental institution. An effort by the legislature to establish some public welfare institutions to assist residents in the state. Meant well, didn't go well. Over time, the hospital was investigated numerous times for allegations of mistreatment of patients, and that really came as patients got more rights and treatment standards changed. The hospital was sued in the O'Connor v. Donaldson in 1975. It did go to the Supreme Court. And what it basically was there was a patient who was Keith Donaldson, and he was being held there. And he sued the hospital and staff for confining him for 15 years against his will. The court ruled in his favor. The court actually ruled that he had been illegally held. The decision, as interpreted by the ACLU, means that it is unconstitutional to commit for treatment a person who is not imminently in danger of themselves or others, and who has the ability of a minimal degree of surviving on their own. Now, basically what all that means is that the Florida State Hospital for the Insane, or the Chattahoochee Asylum, was basically just a place where you could put people you didn't want to deal with. It was a place for, women who didn't do what their husband said, or they were in hysteria. I'm using that with quotations. Children that weren't wanted. People who were suffering from mental health or other kind of issues. What we would now today call, I don't know how to say it properly, but I've always heard it as mental retardation. So forgive me if that offended you, but that's what I'm talking about. This is a place where they just put those people. A lot of times mental health and mental retardation are nowhere near the same thing. And so you have a mental health person who's violently insane because you're not treating them correctly, and they're going to attack a mental retardation patient who can barely take care of themselves. As you can see, brutality ran rampant here, almost as bad as when it was a prison. It does not have the greatest reputation for obvious reasons. You have to think of what all this building has seen. It's seen a jail, a war, and now just overcrowding and understaffed and undertreated patients. And it was not good. Florida funded this to be a state mental hospital that was supposed to be a safe place to care for people who were a danger to themselves or others, or could not take care of themselves. But of course, budget cuts, neglect, and it basically just allowed for violent patients to roam the halls with no supervision, and probably one worker to 45 people. Nobody's safe. No one is safe. And there's plenty of stories about how bad this place was. The one that I can talk to you about is Anthony Barsotti. He was in the Florida State Hospital. He had gone there from Gainesville. He was 23 years old. He was living in the state's care at Gainesville Mental Hospital. He took a swing at another mental health patient, and the orderly pretty much launched him head first into a concrete wall. This is back in 2010. This has not been that long ago. You have to understand that these same things, even though this is Gainesville, was absolutely going on in Chattahoochee. Now, after he was launched headfirst into a concrete wall, the hospital workers should have stepped in and saved him. He had a cracked skull, and instead of looking at a skull, they put a Band-Aid on his finger. When he grabbed his head and howled in pain, they gave him Tylenol. And you can see all this. This is all from their camera footage. He stopped talking. He goes limp. Nobody bothers to check him. Anthony is in trouble. He needs 911. Nobody calls it for hours. The problem with that is that even before 2010, when Anthony pretty much was left to die because a worker who was not, probably didn't have the correct, he should have been there. He was not trained. He was not compassionate. He did not care. Healthcare is not for the weak. Basically they just let people roam, and they didn't do anything until they had to. And in the case of this one, it caused Anthony to die. And this is 2010, y'all. This is now. This still unfortunately happens. But back in the early 1900s, late 1800s, when Chattahoochee was open, this happened in mass proportions. You're talking people who roam the halls, people were trying to defend themselves, filth, disgust, workers who were just barely trying to make it or survive on their own. It's a very sad thing. It could have been a great thing because, state funding could have gone a lot further, but unfortunately it got cut. And, it failed all these people. And this one, the O'Connor v. Donaldson, really kind of brought that into light. Because it was a landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on mental health that, if someone who, just because you deem them to be a problem, may not be a problem. He was held for 15 years in the Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee due to needs of care, maintenance, and treatment. He filed a lawsuit, and he won, because he claimed that the hospital and staff members robbed him of his constitutional right by basically kidnapping him. He won his case. He got money and damages. And it's pretty much a landmark case that still stands to this day. It's when they finally had to define mental illness. And they found that finding a mental illness alone cannot justify a state's locking a person against their will or keeping them indefinitely in simple custodial confinement. And that's really what happened to people in the Chattahoochee Asylum. They really didn't. They just put them away, like out of sight, out of mind. We don't have to deal with you. And that's really what happened to a lot of the people in these kind of places. And unfortunately, Chattahoochee was one of the worst. Hey guys, I just want to take a second to tell you about Maine Love Water. It's rooted in Maine, it's made with care, and it's designed to refresh body and mind. Stay hydrated, stay present, and enjoy Maine Love Water. And that's not the only bad thing that really happened. There was another case actually brought against the Chattahoochee Asylum, and that is Ford versus Wainwright. And that is where basically, this is such a sad case too. Basically, you cannot execute the insane. This is really where not guilty by reason of insanity comes into play. So Alvin Bernard Ford was convicted of first-degree murder back in 1974, and he was sentenced to death in Florida. And what happened is Ford had shot and killed Officer Walter Ilyankoff during a Red Lobster robbery in Fort Lauderdale. One of his co-defendants, Alvin Lewis, pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life. But in Ford's case, he was convicted and put on death row. In 1982, while on death row, Ford's mental health diminished to the point where he became what looked to be a schizophrenic patient. He began to refer to himself as Pope John Paul III and reported such accomplishments as thwarting a vast KKK conspiracy to bury dead prisoners inside the prison walls. And so basically you can tell that at that point he needed to have more help than just be on death row. But of course they didn't care. 3 three psychiatrists were eventually called to examine his behavior. And it was concluded that while Ford had psychosis and various mental disorders, he was still capable of understanding the nature of the death penalty and what effect it would have on him. Florida Governor Bob Graham acted without further comment on the panel's findings, but in accordance with Florida statute in signing the death warrant in 1984. Ford sued the Secretary of Department of Corrections, Louis L. Wainwright, in this case. And basically what it was they had to review the evolving standards of the Eighth Amendment, and they wanted it to be consistent with the progress of a maturing society. Therefore, not tolerant of acts traditionally considered savage and inhumane, but kind of against the execution of the mentally insane. The court reasoned that the execution of the insane did not serve any peniological goals because the peniological goals were to reform and release. Basically, they said that Florida's procedures for determining this man's competency was absolutely inadequate. So, he was taken off death row. He was transferred to Florida State Hospital for treatment. After he was reevaluated, he was found to be incompetent to be executed. In 1989, a federal judge ruled that Ford was sane, but the defense lawyers again appealed. Unfortunately, the appeal was pending when Ford died of a respiratory illness at only the age of 37 in 1991. So basically, this man is one of the main reasons why, he stood up. Someone stood up for him and said, "You cannot execute me if I do not know what I'm doing." And while that's a sad truth, it is a truth. And really, that's another reason that this Chattahoochee Asylum, Florida State Hospital got such a bad rap, because they're just dealing with it until they can get rid of them. And of course, it was a forensic psychologist in the forensics wing to actually evaluate the inmate's competency to be executed. And that's why we have the common law now that says the insane cannot be executed. And it's, Ford took his case again to the Supreme Court and he won. The court ruled that a forensic professional must make an evaluation and the inmate must be found to be incompetent, provide treatment in the aid to gain their competency to then be able to execute. And they weren't doing that. They were not providing treatment to the individual to enable the person to become competent. But also it kind of creates an ethical dilemma, for healthcare professionals. Nonetheless, the place was not good. Like I said, it is an old building. It has seen a lot of history, and it has seen a lot of notable inmates. One of the most interesting ones, though, was Victor Licata. Victor Licata was known as the Dream Slayer. He was an American mass murderer who used an axe to kill his family in Ybor City, so Tampa. The killings were reported in the media as the work of an axe-murdering marijuana addict. I'll give you a second to think about that one. Basically, they said that recreational drugs such as cannabis and crime were linked. Victor Licata did commit murder. That is absolutely a fact. But he also became the main reason why people were so against marijuana. Because they thought that if you smoked it or ate it, you would end up killing your family. But because of him, he influenced the idea that marijuana causes criminal insanity. But he was at the Florida State Hospital. Ruby McCollum. She was a married African-American woman convicted of shooting and killing a prominent white doctor in Live Oak, Florida. Basically, she said that she was raped by him and forced to have his child. Her conviction was overturned on appeal as a technicality, and she was ruled mentally incompetent to go to second trial. She was committed to the hospital in 1954, but released under the Baker Act of 1974. So she spent 20 years in this hospital. She's actually a very interesting case. She's on my to-do on the podcast because I think it's fascinating, this poor woman. Chris Calhoun was a Korean War vet who suffered from PTSD. The film Chattahoochee was actually made about his experiences in the Florida State Hospital. John William Closure, known as the Florida Fox, was a former police detective who appeared for a time on the FBI Most Wanted list. Closure actually escaped the Florida State Hospital in 1967 while having been previously committed in the wake of a kidnapping and armed robbery. He turned himself in 1974. Man, if it's been almost 10 years since you escaped, I'm gone. Like, I'm in Cuba at that point. I'm just saying. Devin Arthurs was another notable inmate. He was an 18-year-old convert to Islam who killed 2 of his neo-Nazi roommates for disrespecting his conversion. Then you got Jesse Delbert Daniels, was a disabled man who was accused of raping before committed to the state hospital for 14 years. Never even stood a trial, and was released on an appeal because he never had a trial. He was just put in there, which I think is kind of insane. You're supposed to have a trial. That's kind of how this works. There is one more case that was against the Florida State Hospital. It was Gideon versus Wainwright. We've already had Ford versus Wainwright. Wainwright just keeps getting, man, maybe you should pay attention if you're the problem. He was the corrections director. And basically what it was another landmark U.S. case that went to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled that the Sixth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which the Sixth Amendment is the rights in a criminal prosecution, which requires the U.S. states to provide attorneys to criminal defendants who are unable to have them on their own, which basically means if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided to you to give you that part of the Miranda rights. The case extended the right to counsel, which had been found under the Fifth and Sixth Amendments, to oppose requirements on the federal government by imposing those on the states as well. So basically, if you have to do it against a federal case, you have to do it in the state's case. This is actually a super landmark case. I remember studying this when I was studying law. Basically what happened is, back in 1961, a burglary occurred in Panama City. An unknown person broke a door, smashed a cigarette machine and a record player, and then stole money from a cash register. Later that day, witnesses reported seeing Clarence Earl Gideon in the pool room around 5:30 that morning, leaving with a wine bottle, a Coke, and some change in his pockets. Based on the accusations alone, police arrested Gideon and charged him with breaking, entering, and committing larceny. Gideon appeared in the court by himself because he was too poor to hire a defense attorney. And basically what happened is in the court, the judge actually said, "I'm sorry, but I cannot appoint counsel to represent you in this case. Under the laws of the state of Florida, the only time that you can appoint counsel to represent a defendant is when the person is charged with a capital offense." So like murder. He denied his request. Gideon apparently told him, "The U.S. Supreme Court says I'm entitled to representation by counsel." This man knew his rights. They again declined. As a result, Gideon had to act as his own counsel and conduct his own defense. The jury did return a guilty verdict and sentenced him to serve 5 years in the state prison. He filed a petition on habeas corpus, which basically is a legal procedure invoking the jurisdiction of a court to review the unlawful detention, which basically means bring the corpse. That's actually what it means. And basically he was saying he was held against his will because he wasn't given the rights he was supposed to. He made use of the prison library and prison stationery, and he appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court to sue, again, Lewis L. Wainwright. The Supreme Court decided to hear his case, and on March 18th, 1963, it was delivered by Justice Hugo Black. The decision was announced in unanimous favor, 9-0, for Gideon, which basically said that he was not given his rights under the Constitution and that you have to uphold them even as a state. Now, because of Gideon versus Wainwright, 2,000 people were freed in Florida alone, just in Florida alone, because of the decision. The decision did not directly result in Gideon being freed. Instead, he received a new trial with an actual defense on the government's expense. So, as you can see, people that were put in this hospital were sometimes not meant to be there at all. They had no business being there. They should not have been there. And they do say it's now haunted. They do say it's haunted by a lot of different spirits. Um, I looked it up and I can't find, like, there's everybody says it's haunted based on its horrible past, but they they don't really talk about what it is. Um, they say they feel bad spots. They say they feel malicious feelings. Um, but like nobody really talks about what is still haunting the Florida State Hospital, um, which is really interesting. It's you put these people through all this and you didn't expect it to be haunted. It's seen war, it's seen prisoners, and now it's seen the insane, um, who may or may not should have been there. Um, but people do say that this one is really, really haunted. And if you look it up, um, they do kind of talk about it a little bit, but nobody will actually come out and say, and I don't know if that's because it's still open. I don't know if it's because they've been told to not talk about it, but it's a very, very interesting, um, it's so strange that you can find stuff, but you can't find stuff. Um, and honestly, probably the patient stories from this place are far more scary than to see that a spirit is roaming the hallways. Um, there have been many, like I said, many things made about it. You can find Chattahoochee, the story or the movie. You can see, well, it's a film. It's not really a movie. It's like a film. You can read the books on Ruby McCollum. Um, you can Google it, and there's just a ton of information about this place that does not paint it in a great light. Um, I'm not really sure how it's still able to be open, but it is. It's actually an open working mental health, and you just can't help but feel for these. You can't help but feel for these people, and especially in the town of Chattahoochee. Um, they probably didn't want to deal with this. They probably have a nice town. I've never actually been to it. Probably have a really nice town from the looks of it. It's a small town, and I guarantee you they just didn't want that on their plate. Um, and it does make me sad. It makes me sad that back then people who weren't wanted were just put away. Um, and I mean, yes, if you're giving the right kind of help, absolutely, people need that kind of help. But just it's so sad. It's so sad to know that the unwanted were just put away and had to fend for themselves in a place that should have taken care of them. Now, like if you're talking about Florida man, yeah, some Florida men probably definitely deserve to be in there. Um, this Florida man he deserves to be somewhere. Florida man drives flaming car down highway charged with DUI. Um, a man was arrested in Melbourne, Florida, after driving a flaming car down US 192 in Brevard County. Deputies first responded to the scene at 6:20 after getting reports of a sedan traveling down the road with heavy smoke coming out, before finally getting a call that it was engulfed in flames. When they arrived, there was a 75-foot stretch of land that was freshly charred, and parts of it were still on fire. Um, I mean, this man has a full mullet. That's what I'm going to tell you. Um, of course, the fire rescue put it out, and 60-year-old Patrick I can't say his last name, was pulled over um, after trying to continue to drive with the car on fire. He was finally stopped. And the police say he later told the police that he was barely able to help his wife escape the burning car. The responding deputies said that while speaking to him, his eyes were bloodshot and watery, his speech was slurred, and there was a strong smell of alcohol. He admitted to having at least one large Budweiser before driving, and a large bottle of liquor was found in the passenger floorboard. He refused to provide a breath sample. He was later subsequently charged with DUI and refusal to submit to a DUI test. I mean, some people like that might deserve to be in that place, but that is a darker history of Florida. that doesn't often get talked about, so I thought we would give it its rightful due. I do hope that you guys have a great week. I hope that you have learned something interesting. I will have a better topic, a funner topic, a happier topic next week. Stay warm if you're in the part of Florida that's about to freeze to death. Drink your water, wear your sunscreen. You still get sunburned in January. I know this for a fact. If you have a suggestion, just email me or reach out to me on any of the social media guys. I hope everybody has a great week. And as always, that's your daily dose of sunshine.
This podcast is a production of Unfiltered Studios. If you would like to know more about joining Unfiltered Studios, please visit our website at unfpod.com for more information.